history celebrates Joseph II as the architect of enlightened reforms, a tireless emperor who rewrote laws, challenged tradition, and tried to breathe life into a faltering empire. But behind the bronze statues and the polished rhetoric lies a darker silence, one shaped not by politics, but by the private cruelty of indifference. Maria Josepha of Saxony arrived in Vienna as his second wife, a gentle soul raised in the quiet chapels of Dresden, ready to give her life to a man who had already given his heart to someone buried in the earth. She smiled when commanded, prayed when expected, stood exactly where protocol placed her, and waited for affection that never came. Joseph, still haunted by the radiant memory of his first wife, Isabella of Parma, looked through her as if she were air. And when illness finally struck her down, when she lay asking softly why he would not come, the emperor who demanded compassion from a nation offered none to the woman dying just a corridor away. Her tragedy was not a single act of betrayal, but a long, suffocating erasure. A life lived unseen, unheard, and unloved at the very center of imperial power. Maria Josepha of Saxony entered the world on 4th November 1731 as one of those quiet, dutiful daughters born into the great European dynasties. Girls expected to embody piety, obedience, and composure long before they understood the meaning of any of those words. Her father, Augustus III of Poland and Elector of Saxony, ruled 2 realms but commanded little affection from his subjects. Her mother, Maria Josepha of Austria, was a granddaughter of Emperor Leopold I and carried the weight of Habsburg expectations like a second spine. From her first breath, Maria Josepha stood at a crossroads of 2 powerful houses, an infant with a destiny shaped by foreign policy long before she could speak. Dresden, the city in which she spent her childhood, was a place of glittering facades and heavy silences. Marble galleries echoing with polished footsteps, chapels scented with incense and candle wax, and tutors whispering catechism to children who understood that salvation and duty were intertwined. It was a world where grandeur pressed down on the spirit rather than lifting it, and where every child of the electors learned early that affection was a luxury and discipline a certainty. Within this carefully regulated universe, Maria Josepha grew into a figure described by those around her as gentle, soft-spoken, and delicate in temperament. A girl whose shyness was not the result of fear, but of a deep inner reserve shaped by years of quiet observation. While her siblings learned to ride, dance, and navigate the complex rituals of court life, she found solace in prayer, music, and reading. Her tutors praised her diligence and modesty. Her confessor noted a surprising depth of devotion for someone so young. She moved through the rooms of the Dresden Residenzschloss with the silent grace of someone who understood that attention was to be avoided, not sought. In a court where emotional restraint was considered a virtue, Maria Josepha seemed designed for the role, possessing an innate gentleness that made her agreeable to all and memorable to none. She did not dazzle. She soothed. She did not command. She complied. Yet beneath this surface lay a world shaped by political necessity. As the daughter of a ruler whose dual crown often placed Saxony at the mercy of shifting alliances, Maria Josepha's future was never her own. Every lesson she learned was part of a lifelong choreography preparing her to be given away, to represent her house with humility, to serve as a living treaty, to smooth tensions between dynasties through obedience and fertility. Her mother, who had herself been raised in the rigid embrace of Habsburg Catholicism, oversaw her children's spiritual and intellectual formation with uncompromising discipline. The girls were not encouraged to dream, but to submit. Not to question, but to accept. Under this maternal governance, Maria Josepha's softness hardened into duty. The way clay becomes brick simply by being exposed to enough pressure and time. Visitors to the Saxon court often compared its atmosphere to a monastery, solemn, ritualistic, permeated with a sense of divine judgment. For a child as naturally quiet as Maria Josepha, such an environment did not crush her. Instead, it shaped her into a figure whose identity rested on service, compliance, and a desire to cause no burden. But every quiet court shapes its daughters toward a specific fate, and hers was to be ideal for arranged marriage. Uncontroversial, well-educated, pious, and politically useful. As she blossomed into adulthood, her reputation remained consistent. She was devout without being severe, courteous without being vain, and intelligent in a way that never threatened anyone. In short, she was precisely the kind of princess other courts considered safe, a jewel designed to fit neatly into another dynasty's setting. What no one could teach her, however, was how to exist beside a husband who would refuse even to acknowledge her presence. Her upbringing had prepared her to be patient, to be supportive, to be loyal. But it had never prepared her to live in a marriage defined not by conflict, but by absence. Her mother could instruct her in piety, her tutors could shape her intellect, the rituals of the Dresden chapel could refine her sense of duty. None of these things could prepare her for a man who would not look at her, speak to her, or extend even the smallest gesture of human warmth. She had been trained in the fires of obedience, but not in the cold of indifference. Still, as she grew into a young woman, Maria Josepha harbored the small, quiet hopes that so often accompany sheltered youth. That marriage might bring companionship, that her gentleness might be reciprocated, that her lifelong discipline might one day blossom into affection. The tapestries of Dresden told stories of queens who brought stability to kingdoms. The hymns sung in chapel told of women whose devotion softened even hardened hearts. She believed, without arrogance or ambition, that she might one day inhabit such a role. It was not grandeur she sought, but belonging. And yet, even as she prepared for her adult role, Europe around her trembled. Wars reshaped alliances, births and deaths rebalanced the chessboard of dynastic marriages, and the Habsburgs, her mother's kin, cast their gaze across the courts of Europe, seeking suitable matches for their children. It was inevitable that Maria Josepha's name would one day appear in those calculations. She was of impeccable bloodline, of steady character, of unblemished virtue, and of temperament deemed ideal for a political marriage. Thus, while she lived her quiet Dresden life, attending Mass, learning courtly French, practicing the clavecin, and mastering the silent art of modest self-effacement, her future was already being discussed in rooms she would never enter. She remained unaware that she was being considered for a role that would define, then destroy, the rest of her life. The second wife of Archduke Joseph, heir to the Habsburg throne, a man whose heart was already bound to a ghost. When Maria Josepha of Saxony was proposed as a bride for Archduke Joseph, heir to the Habsburg throne, the match pleased nearly everyone, except the man expected to enter it. Diplomats praised the union for tightening the long, sometimes fragile bond between Austria and Saxony. Advisors noted her impeccable pedigree, her spotless moral reputation, and her gentle, unthreatening temperament. And above all, Empress Maria Theresa approved. She wanted a daughter-in-law who would be dutiful, pious, and politically unproblematic. Someone who could soothe the rawness left in her eldest son after the death of his first wife. In Dresden, the proposal appeared as the highest of honors, a Saxon princess being chosen to become the future empress of the Habsburgs. But fate had quietly poisoned the foundation long before Maria Josepha ever set foot in Vienna, for she was being offered as a solution to a problem no one fully understood, least of all Joseph himself. To understand the tragedy that followed, one must first understand the love story that preceded it. Joseph's first wife, Isabella of Parma, was unlike anyone he had ever known. Brilliant, melancholic, magnetic, and unafraid to challenge him. She possessed a mind that matched his own, and a charm that softened his sharp, restless spirit. Their marriage, though arranged, blossomed into something rare among royal unions. A passionate, intimate partnership built on shared intelligence and profound emotional connection. Isabella was the only person Joseph allowed to see past his armor of rationality and duty. Her early death in 1763, after only a few years of marriage, struck Joseph with the force of a physical blow. He mourned her not with the quiet dignity expected of a Habsburg prince, but with the consuming grief of a man who had lost the only person he believed truly understood him. For years afterward, he kept her letters, reread her words, and retreated into a loneliness so deep that even his formidable mother hesitated to disturb it. When Empress Maria Theresa finally insisted that he remarry, Joseph treated the idea not as a necessity of statecraft, but as an intrusion into sacred ground. He saw the second marriage as an act of betrayal, of Isabella, of his own heart, and of the idealized memory he had cultivated with near religious devotion. No woman could match Isabella's brilliance or the tenderness he still carried for her. No woman should even attempt to. He felt trapped between personal sorrow and dynastic obligation. And into that tension stepped Maria Josepha, soft-spoken, devout, and entirely unprepared for a man who viewed her presence as a violation of grief rather than an opportunity for companionship. When Joseph met her for the first time, observers hoped he might be softened by her gentleness. Maria Josepha was 24, modest in bearing, humble in conversation, and possessing the quiet dignity that came from years of disciplined upbringing. But Joseph approached the meeting with a rigidity that alarmed even those closest to him. He looked at her with polite detachment, offered curt words, and maintained a formality that went beyond court etiquette. He did not speak cruelly. He simply did not speak much at all. To him, Maria Josepha was not a person to be evaluated or understood. She was an obligation, a symbol of political necessity wrapped in silk and expectation. Maria Josepha, sheltered and eager to please, interpreted his coldness as shyness or reserve. In letters to Dresden, she expressed gratitude for the honor of the match and hoped that she might one day earn her husband's affection. She believed, as she had been taught, that obedience and devotion could soften any heart. She stepped into the marriage with a sense of purpose, convinced that God had placed her on this path for a reason. Joseph stepped into it like a prisoner marching toward the memory of a beloved cell he could no longer re-enter. Their wedding in 1765 reflected the emotional imbalance already taking root. The ceremony in Vienna was grand, as befitted a union intended to strengthen the empire. But those closest to the couple reported a chilling absence of joy. Maria Josepha, modestly radiant in her bridal attire, approached the altar with the hopefulness of someone beginning a new chapter. Joseph approached it with an expression that several witnesses later described as solemn, absent, or withdrawn. He performed each required gesture with mechanical precision, offering his hand not in tenderness but in duty. The very atmosphere seemed to crack under the weight of his resentment. What Maria Josepha did not know, what no one told her, was that Joseph had begged his mother to spare him from this marriage, insisting that his heart was dead, that he could never love again. that he was unfit for conjugal life. Maria Theresa, accustomed to the idea that marriage was service to the state, dismissed these protests as sentimental nonsense. To her, grief was something to be endured, not worshipped. To Joseph, grief was a sanctuary, the last place where Isabella still lived. Thus, before the vows were even spoken, the chasm between them had already formed. Maria Josepha walking toward him with hope in her chest, Joseph walking beside her with grief in his. The tragedy was not that she misunderstood him. It was that she never stood a chance of reaching him at all. She had been chosen to heal a wound that did not wish to close, to fill a space meant for a ghost, to love a man who believed that love itself had died with Isabella. In that moment, before their first night, before their first meal together, before she even heard him speak more than a few sentences, the fate of the marriage had already been sealed. And Maria Josepha, unaware of the invisible coffin she had stepped beside, entered Vienna believing she would build a home. Joseph, carrying the weight of a love buried far too soon, believed he had been forced back into a world from which he wished only to retreat. From the first hour of their marriage, Maria Josepha realized that she had stepped into not a partnership, but an absence, an empty room furnished with duty and cold detachment. The moment the wedding celebrations ended and the courtiers withdrew, the distance Joseph placed between them became unmistakable. It was not merely the formality of a reserved man or the awkwardness of newlyweds. It was a deliberate wall, erected with the precision of someone determined not to let even a sliver of affection seep through. Joseph behaved like a man standing guard over a locked door, the door behind which Isabella of Parma's memory still lived, untouched and fiercely protected. For generations, royal brides had entered foreign courts carrying the expectations of diplomacy and lineage. But few had ever faced a silence as sharp as the one that met Maria Josepha. Joseph avoided her gaze during meals, speaking to her only when etiquette forced him to do so. Even then, his words were clipped, impersonal, as if he were addressing a distant relative rather than a new wife. At evening gatherings, where couples were expected to sit together, he often found excuses to withdraw early. When court musicians played soft pieces meant to encourage intimacy, he sat rigid and unresponsive. He did not even attempt the polite fiction of conjugal interest. Instead, he made it painfully clear that emotional distance was not an accident. It was a principle. The courtiers at Vienna had long whispered about Joseph's grief, but few expected that his mourning would become a weapon turned silently against an innocent woman. At dinners, they observed his refusal to look at her for more than a fleeting moment, his tendency to leave her side abruptly, and the way he answered her soft inquiries with the bare minimum required to avoid scandal. One lady-in-waiting wrote privately that the Archduchess's presence seemed to irritate him like a draft of cold air. Another noted that Maria Josepha possessed a kindness that should have melted any reasonable man. But Joseph remained untouched, unbending, unapproachable. To his mother, he was even more direct. When Maria Theresa urged him to show the slightest warmth, if not love, then at least courtesy, Joseph responded with words that horrified even her iron will. "I have nothing to say to her." It was not anger. It was a declaration of emotional vacancy. She was, to him, a symbol of dynastic coercion, a reminder of a command he had obeyed against his own heart. Even Maria Theresa, who had orchestrated the marriage with political calculation, began to understand that she had placed an unwitting lamb before a man still guarding the grave of his first wife. Maria Josepha, raised in a court where humility was praised and obedience considered a virtue, interpreted his aloofness not as cruelty, but as personal failure. She believed she had somehow disappointed him, that she had not smiled warmly enough, prayed devoutly enough, or spoken gently enough to earn his attention. She spent her first days as a wife walking carefully, speaking softly, trying desperately to find a gesture that might pierce his reserve. She wrote to her family describing him as serious and distant, but added hopefully that she believed time would soften him. It was a hope rooted less in naivety than in the lifelong certainty that duty, patience, and kindness could bridge any divide. But Joseph had already decided that the bridge would never be built. His refusal was not a momentary reaction, but a conscious posture. He would not share her chambers. He would not engage in personal conversation. He would not, under any circumstances, permit himself to feel. He once confided to a trusted aide that convincing him to take a second wife was an injustice, and that he would not compound the injustice by pretending affection he did not feel. He believed that emotional honesty meant shutting every door rather than opening even one crack. The night of their wedding, which should have marked the beginning of a shared life, instead became a symbol of everything that would follow. As the palace quieted and the corridors emptied, servants stationed near Maria Josepha's apartments reported hearing her weeping softly behind the heavy doors. She did not cry out of humiliation, nor out of anger, but out of the quiet, aching realization that she had been given to a man who would not even try to reach her. She had trained all her life for this role: wife, consort, companion. And yet the door to that life had been closed before she even knocked. Her attendants tried to comfort her, telling her that many royal marriages began coldly and warmed with time. But Maria Josepha, perceptive in ways her upbringing did not encourage her to show, sensed the deeper truth. This was not a cold beginning. It was a refusal to begin at all. And so, in the vast palace of the Hofburg, with its gold leaf ceilings and endless rooms, she took her place beside a man who had already chosen to live in memory rather than in marriage. Joseph's devotion to the dead overshadowed every step she took. His silence was not merely the absence of words. It was a fortress built around a grief she had never been meant to approach. And in that silence, Maria Josepha's tragedy began to take shape. A tragedy not of conflict or betrayal, but of erasure. She had married a man who had already given his heart away, and who believed that the greatest loyalty he could offer his lost Isabella was to deny his living wife even the smallest piece of it. In the weeks that followed the cold, echoing silence of her wedding night, Maria Josepha tried, quietly, faithfully, almost desperately, to inhabit the role she had been raised for. She understood that royal marriages were not meant to mirror the warmth of ordinary households. She knew that love was a luxury, not a guarantee, and that duty often weighed heavier than affection. But even within those expectations, she believed that kindness could open doors, that patience could soften distance, and that gentle perseverance might one day draw her husband into something resembling companionship. What she did not know, what no one told her, was that Joseph II's heart had become a shrine dedicated to grief, and that grief, once enthroned, yields to no earthly tenderness. Maria Josepha rose each morning determined to fulfill every aspect of her position. She attended Mass with solemn devotion, walking the stone corridors of the Hofburg with her prayer book held tightly in pale hands. She participated in charitable works arranged by the imperial household, offering food and alms to the poor of Vienna. She learned the rhythms of the court precisely, memorizing each ceremony, each gesture, each protocol owed to her new station. She greeted visiting dignitaries with practiced grace, curtsied at the appropriate angles, and spoke softly to the ladies assigned to her service. In every movement, she radiated a gentleness that made even hardened courtiers whisper that she was too good for this house. But kindness, when offered to a shutting door, becomes its own kind of suffering. Joseph, already avoiding her in public, seemed to retreat even further whenever she attempted the smallest gesture of connection. If she sent him a note expressing concern for his health, he ignored it. If she attempted to speak with him before a ceremony, he answered curtly and turned away. If she offered a compliment or a thoughtful observation, he responded as though her words were an inconvenience. Her presence did not anger him. It wearied him, like a duty he resented having to acknowledge. What made the rejection more piercing was the nature of the woman he compared her to, whether consciously or not. Isabella of Parma had been bright, witty, intellectually vibrant, and emotionally complex. She had challenged Joseph, provoked him, softened him, and wounded him. She had been the flame that matched his restless mind. Maria Josepha, in contrast, possessed a quieter soul, gentle, obedient, devout. But rather than appreciating her softness as a balm for his grief, Joseph viewed it as a flaw. Her piety seemed to him excessive, her modesty uninspiring, her reserve a void rather than a virtue. He once remarked to a confidant that she was too pious, too timid, too dull, a criticism that revealed more about his wound than her worth. He did not want another Isabel, yet he punished her precisely for not being Isabella. Even the Empress Maria Theresa, who had chosen Maria Josepha with the sincere belief that virtue would heal her son, began to notice the growing chasm between them. She urged Joseph to treat his wife with basic civility, reminding him that emotional cruelty was unbecoming of both a prince and a man. But Joseph, trapped in a private battlefield no one else could access, responded with cold rationalizations. He insisted that misleading Maria Josepha with false warmth would be a greater sin than ignoring her entirely. He believed he was being honest. In truth, he was simply refusing to confront the depth of his own brokenness. Maria Josepha, perceptive in the way that only the quietly wounded become, saw that nothing she did softened him. But still she tried. When he returned from travels, she greeted him with hopeful composure. When he appeared in public, she positioned herself discreetly nearby, hoping perhaps he might acknowledge her presence. When he fell into melancholy, she prayed for him. Long, fervent prayers whispered into chapel shadows that never reached his ears. She never complained, never confided in her attendance, never indulged in anger. She assumed the fault must lie within herself. She did not know that she was confronting a grief so profound it had become an identity. Joseph, meanwhile, found her goodness suffocating. Her gentleness reminded him of duties he wished he could escape. Her attempts at kindness pressed against the door he had bolted shut. Her presence, quiet as it was, challenged the private world he had built with Isabella's memory, a world where no one else belonged. And so he hardened further. He retreated not only from affection, but from acknowledgement, creating a marriage defined not by conflict, but by erasure. Those who observed them began to speak of the mismatch in whispers. How Maria Josepha's soft eyes followed her husband with unspoken hope. How Joseph avoided her gaze with almost physical discomfort. How the air between them seemed colder than the marble halls they walked. "She is too gentle for him," one courtier wrote. Another noted, "Her kindness pains him because it asks for something he cannot give." In this cruel dynamic, Maria Josepha was condemned not through fault, but through contrast. She was judged against a ghost, against a love story she had not lived and could never equal. Her virtues became her accusations, her piety a sign of dullness, her modesty a mark of inadequacy, her quiet devotion evidence that she could never ignite the fierce, consuming passion Joseph had once known. And yet, through it all, she remained steadfast, painfully hopeful, heartbreakingly patient, standing before a man whose grief had turned to stone. She did everything right, everything she had been taught, everything expected of a royal wife. But her goodness fell like light on a shuttered window, and the tragedy that had begun on her wedding night deepened into a cruel truth. She was living beside a man who did not merely refuse to love her. He refused even to see her. Life inside the Hofburg Palace was a theater of hierarchy, ritual, and spectacle. An endless cycle of ceremonies in which every gesture reinforced the weight of imperial order. Yet within this vast, gilded labyrinth, Maria Josepha moved like a faint outline, a quiet figure whose existence fulfilled protocol, but seldom penetrated the deeper life of the court. The very walls of the Hofburg seemed to whisper her insignificance. She was present, required, accounted for, but rarely acknowledged as a living, feeling human being. The court of Vienna, unlike the restrained piety of Dresden, was a storm of political maneuvering, intellectual debate, and relentless activity shaped by the towering personality of Empress Maria Theresa. Ministers rushed through corridors with documents rolled under their arms. Courtiers traded rumors like currency. Diplomats lingered in salons seeking influence, and aristocratic families constantly jockeyed for favor. In this environment of ambition and assertion, Maria Josepha's mildness rendered her nearly invisible. She spoke when spoken to, smiled politely at conversations she was not invited to join, and maintained the rigid courtesy expected of an archduchess consort. Publicly, she performed her duties flawlessly. She presided at dinners with serene composure, distributed alms to the poor with genuine compassion, and attended Mass with a devotion that impressed even the clergy. But these acts, admirable as they were, did not draw Joseph closer. If anything, they seemed to bore him further into his shell. The emperor-to-be was consumed by intellectual pursuits, administrative reforms, and a relentless internal melancholy. To a mind as restless and ferociously analytical as Joseph's, Maria Josepha's simplicity appeared like a flat plain beside a mountain range, a landscape he refused to explore because he was convinced it held nothing of interest. When the court gathered for evening entertainments, Joseph positioned himself in circles of military officers, scholars, or reform-minded ministers. He spoke rapidly, gesturing with restless intensity, dissecting ideas with a sharp, almost impatient wit. Maria Josepha, meanwhile, was assigned a seat slightly behind or beside him, according to protocol. From there, she listened quietly, while others engaged her husband in conversation. It was not that she lacked intelligence. By all contemporary accounts, she was well-read, fluent in multiple languages, and capable of thoughtful reflection. But she had never been taught to assert herself in intellectual discourse. Dresden had not trained its princesses to debate. It had trained them to obey. Thus, she existed on the periphery of Joseph's world, always present but never invited in. At receptions, she stood near him, hands folded, offering polite smiles to guests who bowed respectfully, yet rarely lingered to speak with her. When foreign envoys extended formal compliments, she responded graciously. But everyone understood that the true power in the room belonged to Joseph and Maria Theresa. Maria Josepha was a ceremonial ornament, pleasant, proper, and ultimately ignorable. The Hofburg itself added to her isolation. Its sprawling architecture, with endless halls, mirrored galleries, secluded courtyards, and chambers arranged like a maze, allowed Joseph to avoid her without appearing openly cruel. He could slip through side corridors, retire to his private study, engage in long meetings, or vanish on solitary walks in the palace gardens. Maria Josepha, constrained by stricter expectations of female decorum, moved mostly within the designated apartments assigned to her. She filled the long hours with prayer, embroidery, reading devotional texts, and performing small acts of charity that never reached Joseph's ears. Even among the women of the court, she remained a quiet outsider. Vienna's ladies-in-waiting were accustomed to lively exchanges, whispered confessions, and subtle intrigues, things Maria Josepha neither encouraged nor understood. She did not gossip, she did not flirt, she did not maneuver for influence. She offered warmth, not strategy, an approach that earned respect but little genuine companionship. A few attendants felt sympathy for her, noting the sadness that settled over her like a thin veil. But even they were hampered by the rigid boundaries of palace etiquette. And yet, despite her isolation, she never allowed resentment to harden her. She did not speak ill of Joseph, even in private moments. She did not challenge his neglect or appeal to Maria Theresa for intervention. Instead, she attempted to create a small pocket of meaning within the vast emptiness of her marriage. She devoted extra time to visiting hospitals and orphanages, offering comfort to those who had no place in the glittering life of the imperial court. She developed a habit of rising before dawn to pray in the palace chapel, where the early morning light filtered through stained glass and cast soft colors across the marble floor. Those who saw her there described her as a figure made of light and shadow, kneeling alone in a silence that seemed to echo her inner life. But no amount of virtue could change the simple, devastating truth. Maria Josepha existed in Vienna as a legal necessity, not as a beloved wife. Her role was to secure the succession, to embody dynastic unity, and to stand beside Joseph in ceremonies that projected stability. Yet, ironically, she was excluded from the very stability she helped represent. While Joseph reimagined prisons, drafted reforms, and corresponded with philosophers about the future of the monarchy, Maria Josepha was left to inhabit a quieter, dimmer version of the court. A parallel Vienna where her presence fulfilled a requirement, but never touched the center of imperial life. In the great portraits painted of the Habsburg family during this period, Joseph appears tall, commanding, intense, his posture radiating determination and intellectual fire. Maria Josepha is sometimes included, modestly positioned at the edge of the composition, her face serene but unreadable. Even in art, she is a shadow. A necessary one, perhaps, but a shadow all the same. Her life in the Hofburg had become a silent contradiction. She was the wife of a future emperor, yet she lived like a guest. She held one of the highest positions in Europe, yet she moved through her days as though apologizing for taking up space. And every passing day deepened the sorrowful truth she never dared to speak aloud, that in the very heart of empire, she was seen by all, but known by none. Long before Maria Josepha set foot in Vienna, Europe had already witnessed the quiet tragedy of a queen forgotten by her husband, Elizabeth Christine of Brunswick, the wife whom Frederick the Great abandoned emotionally for 4 long decades. Her life became a cautionary tale whispered through German courts, a reminder that a woman could fulfill every expectation, obey every rule, embody every virtue, and still be left standing alone before the unmovable wall of a man's indifference. But what Elizabeth Christine endured over 40 years, Maria Josepha was forced to endure in 2. Her exile was not physical. She lived in the heart of the Hofburg, surrounded by gold, marble, and servants. But emotional, psychological, and devastatingly intimate. The cruelty she suffered was not enacted through scandal or betrayal. It was the slow suffocation of being treated as though she did not exist. For those who observed the unfolding of this marriage, the parallels became impossible to ignore. There was the same quiet wife, modest and devout, entering a union with hope. The same brilliant, restless husband whose emotional life was tied to ideals and intellectual pursuits rather than companionship. The same dynamic in which the woman served as a symbol of political necessity rather than a partner of equal worth. But Maria Josepha's fate was sharpened by the shadow of Isabella of Parma, Joseph's first wife, whose memory was not merely cherished but exalted. Isabella had become the sacred figure Joseph refused to release, a ghost more present than any living woman. To Joseph, the cruel truth was this: every moment he spent in Maria Josepha's presence felt like a betrayal of the woman he had lost. Isabella had not simply been loved, she had been adored. Brilliant, charming, melancholic, and intellectually alive, she had stirred Joseph's heart in ways he believed could never be replicated. Her death carved a wound so deep that he reorganized his entire emotional world around it. He did not want healing. He did not want replacement. And he most certainly did not want a second marriage. Thus, when Maria Theresa forced him to remarry for the good of the dynasty, Joseph responded not with angry rebellion, but with passive, icy refusal. If he could not escape the marriage, he would at least deny it the intimacy or humanity that might threaten the shrine of grief he had built for Isabella. And so he subjected Maria Josepha to a form of suffering far more elegant and far more painful than open hostility. He measured every interaction with her as though she were an unwelcome intruder. He criticized her piety as excessive, her modesty as dull, her gentleness as a flaw. He found fault in her silences, yet grew irritated when she attempted conversation. Her devotion bored him, her restraint frustrated him, her goodness became a burden he did not want to carry. What she saw as attempts to build a bridge, he interpreted as attempts to invade the sanctity of his grief. Even her virtues became irritants. She was too devout, reminding him of his mother's moral expectations. Too obedient, reminding him of the dynastic pressure he resented. Too modest, reminding him that the fiery brilliance of Isabella could never be replaced. In every softened gesture she offered, Joseph felt the ghost of comparison rising in him. Isabella's laughter had been quick and melodic. Maria Josepha's was shy and barely audible. Isabella engaged him in philosophical debates. Maria Josepha listened quietly, unsure of how to join. Isabella had been a storm. Maria Josepha was a quiet rain. But Joseph was not interested in rain. He was interested only in preserving the storm he had lost. Maria Theresa, who had orchestrated the marriage with the belief that virtue could soothe a wounded heart, found herself increasingly troubled by the reality unfolding before her. She saw a son who had retreated into self-pity and an innocent daughter-in-law who bore the brunt of his emotional exile. The Empress attempted gentle reprimands, urging Joseph to treat Maria Josepha with basic courtesy. But even she could not pierce the fortress of grief he had built. Joseph, for his part, framed his refusal as honesty. He told advisors that he could not pretend affection, that false tenderness would be insulting, that if he could not love his wife, he should at least refrain from lying to her. But this supposed moral clarity concealed a deeper truth. He was unwilling to confront the possibility that healing might lead him away from Isabella's memory. His loyalty to the dead became a weapon, turned not against enemies, but against the gentle woman he shared a palace with. And so Maria Josepha found herself inhabiting a marriage where no step she took mattered, where no word she said found an echo, where no act of devotion softened the granite of his heart. She lived beside him, but never with him. She fulfilled the duties of an archduchess, but never became a wife in the truest sense. She entered every room hoping for a change, and left every room knowing nothing would. Her life became a slow, quiet martyrdom, one that mirrored Elizabeth Christine's, yet unfolded with a swiftness that compounded the pain. Each day reinforced the unspoken reality. She was a placeholder, a symbol, a political bond, a woman chosen not for herself, but for what she represented. And Joseph, in his grief and stubbornness, treated her not as a partner, but as the embodiment of an obligation he had never accepted. In this dynamic, Maria Josepha's tragedy crystallized into something unmistakably cruel. She was condemned not because she lacked merit, but because she had the misfortune of standing before a man who loved only ghosts. By early 1767, Vienna had begun to feel the first tremors of a silent terror. Rumors of smallpox drifted through the city like smoke. Whispers from the markets, murmurs in the palace corridors, uneasy glances exchanged by servants who had lived through previous outbreaks. Smallpox was not a disease that merely frightened people. It humbled empires. It struck without pattern, claimed the strong as easily as the weak, and left even its survivors marked for life. And for the Habsburgs, whose family had already suffered greatly from the illness, it was a specter that haunted every breath of the imperial household. Maria Josepha, devout and gentle to the end, reacted not with fear, but with piety. For her, charity was not a ritual performed for the sake of reputation. It was a genuine extension of her faith. The one aspect of her life in Vienna that remained entirely her own. When news spread that the disease was striking families in the poorer districts, she insisted on visiting the sick, delivering alms, and offering comfort in person. Her ladies protested, terrified not only for her life, but for the political scandal that might follow if the heir's wife fell gravely ill. But Maria Josepha had always lived for duty, and here was a duty that at last felt meaningful. In the dim, crowded rooms of the afflicted, she found something she lacked in the gilded halls of the Hofburg, the sense that her presence mattered. Yet compassion carried a price. Within days of her final visits, she began to feel the unmistakable symptoms: chills, fever, fatigue so heavy it seemed to anchor her to the mattress. Soon after came the rash, the first small and angry pustules that spread like a constellation across her skin. The palace physicians, grim-faced, confirmed what everyone already feared. The Archduchess had contracted smallpox. Her rooms were sealed off, not with the urgency of a beloved patient whose recovery was anxiously awaited, but with the uneasy efficiency of a political inconvenience. Curtains were drawn. Servants whispered. The air itself seemed to sink heavier in her apartments, thick with the knowledge that many who entered would not leave. Maria Josepha, confined to her bed, endured the illness with the same quiet endurance that had defined her entire life. The fever came in waves, searing, disorienting, at times leaving her unable to distinguish dreams from reality. Her face and body erupted in painful sores. Her eyes stung, her limbs trembled, and through it all, she continued to ask the same question, in a voice soft with both hope and disbelief. Where is the prince? Why does he not come? Those who attended her later recalled that she never questioned God, nor fate, nor the unfairness of her life. She questioned only the absence of the one person whose presence she desired, not because he had ever been kind to her, but because she believed that in suffering, hearts might soften. Even the coldest walls, she had been taught, could be warmed by compassion. But Joseph refused. His refusal was startling even to a court long accustomed to emotional restraint. At first, many believed he simply feared infection. The disease was deadly after all, and Joseph's own health was delicate. But as days passed, it became clear that his absence had nothing to do with fear. He did not send messages. He did not ask for updates. He did not stand near her doorway. He did not even permit himself to walk past the corridor leading to her rooms. To those close to him, he offered the same cold, practiced explanation every time. He could not bear her presence. Not because she was ill, but because she reminded him of everything he resented: his obligation to remarry, his mother's pressure, the intrusion upon his grief, the forced burial of Isabella's memory beneath the political demands of empire. Illness did not soften him. It hardened him further. In the face of Maria Josepha's suffering, Joseph clung even more fiercely to the ghost of his first wife, as if giving comfort to his second would be an act of disloyalty to the dead. Meanwhile, Maria Josepha continued to look toward the door that never opened. Her ladies tried to reassure her, telling her that the emperor-to-be was concerned, but constrained by caution. But the Archduchess, perceptive even in agony, sensed the truth. "If he wished to see me," she whispered once, "he would." Her physical pain was immense, but those who watched her believed her emotional pain was greater. She had lived 2 years in a marriage without warmth, but she had maintained hope. Now, on her sickbed, that last fragile hope disintegrated. She understood that nothing, neither prayer, nor humility, nor suffering, could move Joseph's heart even an inch. And so her illness became a kind of martyrdom, a slow, silent extinguishing of a life defined entirely by trying to be good enough for a man who would not look at her. Her piety did not save her. Her obedience did not reward her. Her gentleness did not inspire mercy. The qualities that once made her a prized bride now served only to deepen the tragedy of her final days. As the fever worsened and her vision clouded, she whispered prayers, not for herself, but for Joseph, whose soul she feared was being consumed by grief and pride. It was a final gesture of devotion from a woman who had given everything and received nothing in return. In that dim, suffocating room, Maria Josepha of Saxony faced death the way she had faced her marriage. Quietly, faithfully, with hope fading into silence. A young woman trained for greatness, dying alone except for the attendants charged with watching her fade. And still, until her final lucid moments, she asked for the man who would not come. The final days of Maria Josepha's life unfolded in a quiet, dimly lit chamber, tucked deep within the labyrinth of the Hofburg, a room meant for recovery, but which instead became a place where hope slowly dissolved into resignation. Those who tended her witnessed a kind of unraveling that was as gentle as it was heartbreaking. Her fever ebbed and surged like a tide. Her breathing grew shallow, and the pustules of smallpox swelled, burst, and left raw wounds across the face that had once embodied the serene modesty of Dresden's devout court. But the greatest wound, the one no physician could dress, remained the absence of her husband. Smallpox was an indiscriminate enemy. It struck peasants and princes alike, paid no respect to lineage, and recognized no political boundaries. Within the walls of the Hofburg, however, it operated with a different kind of cruelty. Not through the violence of its symptoms, but through the silence it imposed. Maria Josepha's rooms grew quieter each day. Her attendants moved softly, speaking in hushed tones, as though fearful that sound itself might disturb the fragile thread keeping her tethered to life. the palace physicians came and went, solemn and helpless, offering little more than ritual prayers and ineffective remedies. And yet, even as her body weakened, Maria Josepha's thoughts bent toward one direction, toward the man who remained conspicuously absent. She asked for Joseph repeatedly, her voice thin and wavering. "Will he come today? Has he asked for me?" Her ladies-in-waiting, torn between compassion and truth, offered gentle lies, saying he was occupied, saying he prayed for her, saying he wished her well but could not risk infection. Maria Josepha listened, nodded faintly, and waited. She waited through mornings, afternoons, and long nights broken only by the crackling of candles and the sounds of her own labored breaths. But Joseph did not come. Days turned into a blur of fever. Her senses dulled, the world around her narrowed to the edges of her bed. The smell of vinegar-laced cloths soaked the air. Her vision blurred and darkened. Her attendants often found her gazing toward the door with an expression that was neither hopeful nor despairing, simply expectant, as though she believed that even at the last hour, Joseph might appear. For a moment, the court dared to imagine that he would. Maria Theresa herself, though heavily burdened with the duties of state, visited her daughter-in-law's apartments and left shaken. She understood better than anyone the coldness of her son's temperament. But even she believed that the approach of death might force a crack in his emotional armor. She urged Joseph to visit, to offer comfort, if not out of affection, then out of humanity. Joseph refused her too. He insisted that he could not bear to see Maria Josepha, could not face the possibility of infection, could not disrupt the emotional distance that had become his shield. Some courtiers whispered that he feared the sight of illness would unearth memories of Isabella of Parma's deathbed. Others believed he simply had no space in his heart for pity. Whatever the reason, his absence became the final, devastating thread in the tapestry of her short, tragic marriage. On the night of 13th of March, 1767, Maria Josepha's breathing became ragged. The fever that had tormented her for days now flickered like a candle nearing its end. Her attendants brought a priest who administered the last rites. The Archduchess's lips moved in prayer, though her voice had grown too faint for the words to be heard. She clutched a crucifix with trembling fingers, her body ravaged by disease, her spirit dimmed by exhaustion and disappointment. There was no dramatic moment, no frantic rush for help, no tearful farewell. Death approached her quietly, almost courteously. Those present reported that she looked toward the door one final time, as though listening for footsteps that never came, before closing her eyes and slipping into stillness. She was 35 years old. When news of her death reached the court, it did not send shockwaves. It caused a ripple. A small, brief ripple. The empire was vast. The demands of state were urgent, and Maria Josepha had never been woven deeply into the life of the monarchy. Ministers continued their meetings, courtiers continued their intrigues. Maria Theresa mourned with genuine sadness, both as a mother-in-law and as a woman who recognized how deeply her own decisions had shaped the Archduchess's suffering. Joseph's reaction, or lack thereof, became the subject of quiet scandal. He did not come to see her body. He did not attend her last rites. He did not enter the chapel where she lay briefly before burial. He issued no personal statement of grief. Instead, he ordered that the funeral be conducted swiftly, without the elaborate ceremonies usually afforded to the wife of an heir. Maria Josepha's remains were placed in the earth with dignified efficiency, but without the emotional weight that accompanies true mourning. To many, it was as though she had been a visiting dignitary, rather than a member of the imperial family. A temporary presence now neatly removed. Her life, which had unfolded in the shadows, ended in shadows too. She left no children to carry her memory, no lovers to speak of her tenderness, no letters filled with emotion or longing. Her belongings were quietly inventoried, her apartments reassigned, her existence reduced to a brief mention in the court's official records. And yet, the smallness of her passing did not erase its meaning. Within the Hofburg, a handful of attendants wept privately, not for the loss of a political figure, but for the gentle woman who had moved through the palace with quiet grace, asking for nothing and receiving so little. They remembered the soft smiles she offered when greeted, the whispered prayers she murmured at dawn, the kindness she showed even when her heart must have been breaking. Maria Josepha of Saxony had died as she had lived in Vienna, unseen, unheard, and unloved by the one person whose affection she had been promised. Her tragedy was the opposite of scandal. It was the tragedy of being forgotten even before death arrived. Maria Josepha's death should have been a moment that paused the rhythm of the imperial court. She was, after all, the wife of the heir to one of Europe's greatest dynasties, a woman whose place in the Habsburg lineage had been sealed by law and sacrament. But when the Archduchess breathed her last on 13th of March 1767, the Hofburg did not fall into mourning. It merely shifted, like a machine adjusting to the removal of a small replaceable part. Servants whispered that what shocked them was not her death, but the speed with which the palace adapted to life without her. Her absence created no vacuum. In truth, she had never been allowed to fill the space in the first place. Word of her passing traveled swiftly through the administrative wings of the palace. But the man to whom the news mattered most, her husband, greeted it with a silence so cold that even seasoned courtiers recoiled. Joseph did not ask how she had died, whether she had suffered, or who had been present. He did not request a final look at her face, as was customary. He did not visit the room where she had spent her last hours. Instead, he issued instructions in the same tone one might use while settling an inconvenience. Her funeral should be conducted quickly, without unnecessary ceremony, without prolonged viewing of the body, without the elaborate trappings reserved for a beloved imperial consort. To understand how extraordinary Joseph's reaction was, one must understand Habsburg tradition. The dynasty was built on ritual. Its funerary customs were particularly elaborate. Multiple masses, processions through Vienna, long periods of official mourning, and public displays meant to reinforce dynastic continuity. Even queens who had fallen out of favor were afforded dignity in death. But for Maria Josepha, the rites were stripped down to their minimal form. There was no grand procession, no lingering over her coffin, no solemn vigil attended by family. Her death was treated like the closing of a chapter few had bothered to read. Courtiers exchanged uneasy glances as Joseph's commands were carried out. Several wrote privately of their discomfort, noting that even political marriages, marriages without love, without warmth, without companionship, usually earned a final gesture of respect. One witness recorded that Joseph seemed relieved after her passing, as though the weight of an obligation he had never wished to bear had finally lifted. Another described his demeanor as icy, untouched by human sentiment. Behind closed doors, some whispered the word inhuman. Others whispered heartbroken, not for Maria Josepha's sake, but for Isabella of Parma. For Joseph remained trapped in a grief that prevented him from extending humanity even to the woman who had lived and died at his side. His refusal to mourn Maria Josepha was not merely cruelty. It was a kind of fanatic loyalty to a memory he refused to dilute. Isabella's ghost still ruled him, and he would allow no living woman, even a dead one, to intrude upon that imagined sanctity. Maria Theresa, who had orchestrated this tragic marriage in the belief that it would stabilize her son, found herself torn between imperial discipline and maternal shame. She had never intended for Maria Josepha to be treated with such coldness. The Empress insisted on at least some formal observance, but even she was unable to force Joseph's participation. Tradition ultimately demanded a burial in the imperial crypt, the Kaisergruft, the sacred resting place of the Habsburgs. But even this gesture felt hollow, for Joseph refused to accompany the coffin or appear at the chapel where she lay in brief repose. Maria Josepha's funeral procession, if it could be called such, was a modest line of attendants, a handful of clergy, and a closed carriage bearing a woman whose life in Vienna had been marked by invisibility. There were no crowds of mourners lining the streets. There were no eulogies praising her virtue, no musicians playing somber hymns, no royal presence walking behind the bier. In death, as in life, she was a figure relegated to the edges. When her body was placed in the Habsburg crypt, it joined the remains of emperors, empresses, archdukes, and archduchesses who had shaped European history. But unlike them, her presence there elicited no ceremony. Her coffin was positioned, documented, sealed, and then forgotten. The entry in the official record was painfully brief. Maria Josepha, Archduchess, wife of the heir, died of smallpox 1767. No mention of character, no reflection on her virtues, no acknowledgement of the small, quiet tragedies that had defined her existence in Vienna. Those who had known her mourned privately, away from the marble halls that had swallowed her life without a trace. Her ladies-in-waiting wept quietly as they packed her belongings. Rosaries worn smooth by prayer, letters written to her family but never mailed. Handkerchiefs embroidered with devotional symbols. One attendant kept a small devotional book she had found on Maria Josepha's bedside table, its pages marked with prayers for patience, humility, and strength. As the palace resumed its usual pace, Maria Josepha's name faded quickly from conversation. Within weeks, it was as though she had never lived there at all. Joseph returned to his work with relentless fervor. Ministers resumed their debates. The empire turned its attention to wars, finances, and reforms. The cruelty of her end was not that she died alone. It was that her death barely registered in the world she had been brought to serve. She had arrived in Vienna as a political asset, existed as an afterthought, and departed like a stranger. Her final tragedy was not illness, nor neglect, nor even Joseph's refusal to see her. It was the quiet ease with which those around her moved on. Her life closed without resonance, like a candle snuffed out in a drafty corridor, leaving only a thin curl of smoke to mark that it had ever burned at all. Maria Josepha of Saxony's tragedy was not written in the dramatic language of court conspiracies or public scandals. It unfolded instead in silence. In the soft footsteps she left in the Hofburg's endless corridors, in the whispered prayers she repeated at dawn, in the quiet ache of waiting for a man who would never turn toward her. She was a woman who did everything asked of her: pious, obedient, dutiful, gentle. She caused no trouble, demanded no luxury, challenged no authority. And yet, her life became a living testament to how goodness, when met with indifference, can be erased so completely that even memory struggles to hold it. Joseph II remains celebrated as an enlightened ruler, a reformer who cared deeply for the suffering of his people. But Maria Josepha's story asks the question history rarely considers. What is the worth of public virtue when private cruelty goes unacknowledged? Joseph could sympathize with strangers, yet refused the smallest tenderness to the wife dying only a few doors away. He fought to improve the condition of prisoners while allowing his own consort to fade without comfort, affection, or even recognition. Maria Josepha's short life in Vienna reveals a truth often hidden beneath the shine of imperial power: that some of the deepest wounds are inflicted not by violence, but by the absence of love. She was not destroyed by enemies, nor undone by ambition. She was undone by a void, a husband who could not see past a ghost, a court that treated her presence as incidental, a destiny that demanded obedience but offered nothing in return. Her death, quiet and unmarked, reminds us of all those throughout history who lived in the shadows of great figures, who fulfilled their duties without being remembered, who suffered without witness, and who left the world with no statues, no tributes, no grand accounts of their worth. Maria Josepha stands for the countless souls whose tragedies unfold not in dramatic storms, but in the gentle, devastating erosion of being unnoticed. Her story asks a final, haunting question, one that lingers long after the narrative ends. What does it mean to die unseen, unheard, and unloved, and in the very heart of power? And how many stories like hers have simply slipped through the cracks of history?